The gymnasium fell silent as the transport shuttle's engines powered down outside the Terran Colonial Athletic Center. Through the reinforced windows, the assembled coaches and administrators watched as a figure emerged from the diplomatic vessel, tall, graceful, and unmistakably alien. Her skin held a faint luminescent quality, shifting between pale silver and deep blue depending on the angle of light, and her forearms moved with a fluid precision that seemed to defy human understanding of anatomy. Director Marcus Chen adjusted his collar nervously. The Galactic Sports Commission had been clear in their directive. Earth's recent admission to the Interstellar Athletic Union meant they would be assigned a coach from an established member species. What they hadn't mentioned was that their assigned coach would be Zixthara of the Vale Nathi Collective, a being whose species had dominated competitive athletics across 17 star systems for the past 3 centuries. "Greetings," Zixthara spoke as she entered the facility, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone present. "I am here to prepare your species for the Galactic Championships. You may address me as Coach Zeph." The room remained frozen until a young athlete named Jake Morrison stepped forward. At 19, he was considered one of Earth's most promising decathlon prospects, holder of 3 continental records, and possessed of the kind of natural confidence that comes from never having truly failed at anything physical. His approach carried all the casual arrogance of someone who had spent his entire life being told he was exceptional. "So you're supposed to make us better?" Jake asked, his tone carrying just enough disrespect to make the other humans in the room wince. "No offense, but you don't look like much of an athlete." Coach Zaf turned her attention to him, and for a moment something flickered in her large, multifaceted eyes. Not anger, but something that might have been amusement. "Appearances can be deceiving, young human. But you are correct to question. In the Vale Nathi tradition, a coach must first demonstrate their capability. Would you care to participate in a simple test?" Jake's grin widened. This was exactly the kind of challenge he lived for. "What did you have in mind?" "A basic endurance circuit. Nothing too strenuous by our standards. A mere 5 kilometers run, followed by strength exercises, agility drills, and mental focus challenges." Standard warm-up routine. The other coaches exchanged glances. 5 kilometers was respectable, but hardly impossible for a trained athlete. Jake nodded eagerly. "Let's do it." What followed would be discussed in hushed tones throughout the athletic community for years to come. Coach Zeth began the run at what appeared to be a casual jog, her forearms swinging in perfect synchronization. Jake easily kept pace for the first kilometer, then the second. His confidence began to waver around the 3rd kilometer mark when he realized that Coach Zarth hadn't broken into a sweat, hadn't altered her breathing pattern, and was conducting a detailed analysis of Earth's atmospheric composition, while maintaining what was, for her, an effortless stride. By the 4th kilometer, Jake was gasping for air. By the completion of the run, he was bent over, hands on knees, while Coach Zed stood perfectly composed, not even breathing heavily. She simply smiled, an expression that somehow translated across species barriers, as if the run had been nothing more than a pleasant stroll. "Interesting," she commented, checking a device that had appeared in one of her hands. "Your cardiovascular system shows promise, but your mental conditioning requires significant work. In my species, we believe that physical limits are merely the starting point for true athletic development. Shall we proceed to the strength exercises?" What Jake experienced over the next 2 hours fundamentally altered his understanding of what was possible. Coach Zeth demonstrated lifting techniques that seemed to defy physics, her forearms working in perfect coordination to manipulate weights that should have required mechanical assistance. She moved through agility drills that created afterimages, her body flowing like liquid while maintaining perfect balance and control. Most disturbing of all were the mental focus challenges, exercises that required maintaining complex mathematical calculations while performing physical tasks. Puzzles that demanded the brain to process information in ways human neural architecture had never been designed for. Through it all, she maintained that same serene expression, as if each impossible feat was merely another mundane aspect of proper athletic training. When Jake finally collapsed, completely exhausted and thoroughly humbled, she knelt beside him with something that might have been compassion. "The gap between our species' capabilities is significant," she said softly. "But that gap represents opportunity, not limitation. Your people have something most established athletic species have lost: the hunger of the newcomer, the desperation of those who have everything to prove and nothing to lose. That hunger, properly channeled, can transcend physical limitations." Jake looked up at her, sweat stinging his eyes, his pride shattered but his curiosity ignited. How? By learning to destroy the version of yourself that accepts limits, Coach Seth replied. Physical strength can be defeated by greater physical strength. Technical skill can be overcome by superior technique. But a mind that has conquered its own weaknesses, that has systematically eliminated every excuse, every comfort, every safety net, that mind becomes truly indestructible. Over the following weeks, Coach Zath began implementing training regimens that pushed the human athletes far beyond anything they had previously imagined possible. Her methods were alien in more ways than just their origin. They challenged fundamental assumptions about human physiology, psychology, and potential. The daily routine began before dawn with what she called consciousness expansion exercises, meditation techniques that required athletes to maintain awareness of their entire body while solving increasingly complex mental puzzles. These sessions often lasted for hours, with participants expected to hold physically demanding positions while their minds worked through challenges that seemed designed to break human thought patterns. Your species has remarkable neuroplasticity, Coach Zeth explained during one particularly grueling session where athletes were required to balance on one foot while calculating orbital mechanics. But you've been conditioned to use only a fraction of your cognitive capacity during physical exertion. In the Galactic Championships, victory often belongs not to the strongest or fastest, but to those who can think most clearly while their bodies are being pushed beyond their limits. Jake found himself both fascinated and tormented by these training methods. His natural athletic abilities, which had always been his source of confidence, seemed almost irrelevant in the face of Coach Zart's demands. She required a complete reconstruction of his relationship with his own capabilities. You think in terms of what you can do, she told him, after he had failed, for the 15th consecutive time, to complete a routine that required maintaining a complex philosophical argument while performing what appeared to be a simple gymnastic sequence. Champions think in terms of what must be done. The philosophical aspect of her training proved to be the most challenging element for the human athletes. Coach Zeeth insisted that true athletic excellence required not just physical conditioning, but a complete reconstruction of one's relationship with difficulty, failure, and limitation. In Vale Nathi culture, she explained during one of her theoretical lectures, we have a concept that translates roughly as the strength of the conquered self. It refers to the power that comes from systematically identifying and destroying every internal barrier to achievement. Most beings never reach their true potential because they protect some small part of themselves from the demands of excellence. They preserve a safe space where they can retreat when challenges become too intense. The athletes listened, many of them struggling to understand the implications of what she was describing. Sarah Chen, a promising middle-distance runner and the director's daughter, raised her hand tentatively. But isn't it healthy to have limits? To know when to rest, when to protect yourself from injury or psychological damage? Coach Zoot's expression became thoughtful, and for a moment, her alien features seemed almost human in their contemplation. An excellent question, and one that reveals the sophistication of human psychological development. You are correct that most beings require psychological safety mechanisms. But championship-level athletes exist in a different reality from most beings. They have chosen to sacrifice the comfort of limitations for the possibility of transcendence. She paused, looking around at the assembled athletes. This is not a path for everyone. In fact, it is not a path for most, but for those who choose it, truly choose it, with full understanding of what they are surrendering, it offers something that no external force can ever take away. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already survived the most dangerous enemy he will ever face. Jake felt something shift inside him as he heard these words. All his life he had been comfortable with being exceptional within human standards. But Coach Zeth was offering something far more challenging, the possibility of becoming exceptional by universal standards, of competing not just with other humans, but with beings whose capabilities transcended anything Earth had ever produced. The training intensified as the weeks progressed. Coach Zeth introduced equipment that seemed to operate on principles of physics unknown to human science. Gravity manipulators that could create variable resistance fields, neural feedback devices that provided real-time analysis of mental state during physical exertion, and holographic projectors that could simulate environmental conditions from dozens of different worlds. The Galactic Championships take place on a rotating basis across member worlds, she explained as the athletes struggled to maintain their footing in a simulation of triple gravity conditions while solving spatial reasoning puzzles. Competitors must be prepared to perform at peak levels regardless of atmospheric composition, gravitational variance, or environmental hazards. Physical adaptation is only the beginning. You must learn to maintain psychological coherence under conditions that your species has never evolved to handle. The psychological demands of this training began to take their toll. Several athletes dropped out, unable to cope with the constant challenge to their fundamental assumptions about human limitations. Others experienced what Coach Zath described as cognitive reconstruction episodes, periods of intense disorientation as their minds adapted to processing information in new ways. Jake found himself caught between fascination and terror as he felt his own mental architecture being systematically rebuilt. The confident young man who had casually challenged an alien coach was being replaced by someone he didn't recognize. Someone who could maintain complex analytical thought while his body was being pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. Someone who had learned to find calm center even in the midst of what would have been panic-inducing stress just months before. "You're changing," Sarah observed after a particularly intense training session where they had been required to perform precision tasks while experiencing simulated oxygen deprivation. "We all are." Jake nodded, uncertain whether the change was something to celebrate or mourn. "Do you think we're still human?" Before Sarah could respond, Coach Zeth appeared beside them with that uncanny, silent approach that all of her species seemed to master. "An interesting question," she said, having obviously overheard their conversation. "What do you think defines humanity?" Jake began, then stopped, realizing he no longer had a clear answer. "Your species is remarkably adaptable," Coach Zeth continued. "More so than most. The question is not whether you remain human, but whether you choose to remain limited by your initial human assumptions about what humanity can be." As the training progressed into its third month, the athletes began to demonstrate capabilities that bordered on the impossible. Jake found he could maintain sustained physical exertion at levels that would have killed his former self, while simultaneously performing mental calculations of extraordinary complexity. His reaction times had improved to the point where he could respond to stimuli faster than human neural architecture should have allowed. Most remarkably, he had learned to enter a state of consciousness that Coach Zed described as combat clarity, a mental condition where fear, doubt, and self-preservation instincts were temporarily suspended in service of absolute performance. "You begin to understand," Coach Zed told him after he successfully completed a training sequence that had seemed impossible just weeks before. "Physical strength is finite. Technical skill has limits. But consciousness, properly developed consciousness, is potentially infinite in its adaptability." Yet even as the human athletes developed these extraordinary capabilities, Coach Zed thus herself remained an enigma. No matter how impossible the challenges she set for them, no matter how far they'd pushed themselves, she continued to demonstrate abilities that made their achievements seem modest by comparison. Her casual mastery of every aspect of athletic performance suggested capabilities so far beyond human potential that Jake sometimes wondered if they were training to compete or simply to avoid complete humiliation. "Don't you ever struggle with anything?" he asked her one day after she had effortlessly demonstrated a technique that had taken him weeks to barely approximate. For the first time since her arrival, Coach Zerth's composure seemed to flicker slightly. "An interesting assumption," she replied. "What makes you think I don't struggle? Because you make everything look effortless. Like it's all just nothing to you." Coach Zath was quiet for a long moment, her luminescent skin shifting through several color phases that Jake had learned to associate with deep thought. When she finally spoke, her voice carried undertones he had never heard before. "There was a time when these abilities seemed as impossible to me as they do to you now. The techniques I demonstrate effortlessly cost me decades to master, required me to rebuild my understanding of my own capabilities more times than I can count. The difference between us is not that I don't struggle. It's that I've learned to struggle so efficiently that the effort has become invisible." She looked at him directly, her multifaceted eyes reflecting depths of experience that suddenly seemed vast beyond imagination. "The smile you see when I perform these techniques, that is not the absence of effort. It is the presence of absolute mastery over effort. There is a difference." This revelation fundamentally altered Jake's understanding of what he was witnessing. Coach Zeth's apparent effortlessness wasn't the result of natural ability. It was the product of such complete mastery that the tremendous effort required had become as natural as breathing. Her casual dominance represented not the absence of struggle, but the transcendence of it. As the first phase of training drew to a close, Jake realized that he had been fundamentally reconstructed as both an athlete and as a person. The young man who had cockily challenged an alien coach no longer existed. In his place was someone who had learned to find strength in the systematic destruction of his own limitations. Someone who had discovered that the greatest victories come not from defeating external opponents, but from conquering the internal enemies that whisper of impossibility. Part 2. The Crucible. The second phase of training began with what Coach Zeth called reality integration protocols, exercises designed to bridge the gap between controlled training environments and the chaotic demands of actual competition. The human athletes had spent months developing extraordinary capabilities under carefully managed conditions, but Coach Zeth insisted that true athletic mastery required the ability to maintain peak performance regardless of circumstances. In the Galactic Championships, she explained as the athletes assembled in what appeared to be an empty warehouse space, you will face opponents who have been training for centuries, environmental conditions that will challenge your species' survival mechanisms, and psychological pressures designed to break the mind before the body reaches its limits. Everything you have learned thus far has been preparation for learning how to maintain your capabilities when everything is working against you. The warehouse suddenly transformed as Coach Zeth activated hidden systems. The floor became unstable, shifting between different textures and angles. The atmosphere composition began fluctuating, requiring the athletes to adapt to varying oxygen levels. Gravity fields created zones of increased and decreased weight. Most disorienting of all, holographic projectors filled the space with crowds of alien spectators, whose voices created a cacophony of sounds that human ears had never been designed to process. Welcome to Chaos Training, Coach Zeth announced, her voice somehow cutting through the din with perfect clarity. Your task is to maintain peak performance in all disciplines while adapting to constantly changing conditions. Failure to adapt results in elimination from the program. Jake felt his carefully developed confidence waver as he tried to process the sensory overload. The meditation techniques and consciousness expansion exercises he had mastered in controlled conditions suddenly seemed inadequate when faced with this assault on his perception. Around him, other athletes were struggling similarly, their hard-won capabilities seeming to dissolve under the pressure of too many simultaneous challenges. Focus! Coach Zeth called out, and somehow her voice reached each athlete individually despite the chaos. You have learned to transcend your limitations in perfect conditions. Now learn to transcend them in imperfect conditions. The techniques are the same. The only difference is your willingness to apply them when application becomes difficult. Over the following weeks, chaos training became the new reality. No two sessions were identical. The athletes might find themselves competing in simulated low-gravity environments while solving mathematical equations, or maintaining precision motor control while experiencing simulated atmospheric conditions from high-radiation worlds. Each challenge was designed not just to test their physical capabilities, but to force them to maintain the mental clarity they had developed under increasingly impossible circumstances. Sarah Chen was the first to achieve a breakthrough. During a particularly grueling session involving precision archery while experiencing simulated vertigo and solving philosophical paradoxes, she suddenly found herself entering the state of combat clarity that Coach Darth had taught them. The chaos didn't disappear. Instead, it became incorporated into her awareness without overwhelming it. I can see it now, she told Jake after the session, her eyes bright with excitement and exhaustion. It's not about blocking out the distractions. It's about expanding your consciousness until it can hold all the chaos without being controlled by any of it. Jake watched as, one by one, the other athletes began to achieve similar breakthroughs. But his own progress seemed frustratingly slow. Despite all his training, despite the fundamental reconstruction of his capabilities, he found himself struggling with the transition from controlled mastery to chaotic application. Coach Zeth noticed his frustration during a session where he had failed for the third consecutive time to maintain his performance standards while dealing with multiple environmental challenges. She approached him after the other athletes had left, her expression carrying that same mix of compassion and analytical assessment that he had learned to associate with her most important lessons. You are holding back, she observed simply. I'm giving everything I have, Jake protested, sweat still streaming down his face from the failed exercise. No, Coach Zeth replied with certainty. You are giving everything you think you can afford to lose. There is a difference. She gestured for him to sit, and for a moment, the alien coach and human athlete simply occupied the same space in companionable silence. When Coach Zeth finally spoke, her voice carried undertones that Jake had learned to associate with deeply personal revelation. In Vale Nathi culture, there is a ritual called the surrender of selves. It marks the transition from advanced student to true master. The participant must choose to abandon every psychological safety mechanism, every internal retreat, every comfortable limitation. It is the moment when one chooses to become truly vulnerable to excellence. Jake felt a chill of recognition. What happens if you fail? Failure, in the traditional sense, becomes impossible, Coach Death replied. Not because success is guaranteed, but because the concept of failure loses meaning when you have surrendered the self that could be protected by failure. The implications of this statement took time to fully penetrate Jake's understanding. Over the following days, he found himself contemplating what it might mean to completely abandon the psychological safety nets he had built throughout his life. The young man who had challenged Coach Jarth on her first day had been protected by arrogance, confident that his natural abilities would be sufficient. The athlete he had become through training was protected by technique, secure in the knowledge that he had developed extraordinary capabilities. But both versions of himself maintained some internal space that could retreat when challenges became too intense. The breakthrough came during a session that combined elements from every aspect of their training. The athletes were required to compete in a complex multidiscipline event while dealing with constantly shifting environmental conditions, solving puzzles that required accessing different types of intelligence simultaneously, and maintaining perfect technique despite physical exhaustion that approached the limits of human survival. Jake found himself falling behind as the session progressed. His technique began to deteriorate as his body reached its limits. His mental calculations became sloppy as fatigue compromised his cognitive function. Most dangerously, he felt the familiar psychological retreat beginning. The internal voice that suggested he had pushed far enough, that preservation was more important than performance. In that moment, something in Jake's consciousness shifted. Instead of retreating into the safety of limitation, he chose to advance into the uncertainty of transcendence. He stopped protecting any part of himself from the demands of excellence. The exhaustion didn't disappear, but it stopped being a barrier. The environmental chaos didn't become less intense, but it stopped being overwhelming. The psychological pressure didn't decrease, but it stopped being something to resist. What happened next felt less like athletic performance and more like a fundamental alteration of reality. Jake's body continued to function at peak efficiency despite exhaustion that should have been debilitating. His mind processed multiple streams of complex information while maintaining perfect clarity. Most remarkably, the various challenges stopped feeling like separate obstacles and became integrated aspects of a single, coherent experience. When the session ended, Jake found himself in a state of consciousness he had never experienced before. He felt simultaneously empty and complete, exhausted and energized, vulnerable and indestructible. "Now you begin to understand," Coach Zed said, approaching him with what might have been pride in her expression. "The surrender is not a loss. It is an expansion. You have learned to destroy the version of yourself that required protection from excellence." The other athletes had noticed the change in Jake's performance, but more importantly, they had witnessed something in his approach that transcended technique. He had demonstrated the kind of complete commitment to transcendence that Coach Death had been describing throughout their training. "How does it feel?" Sarah asked him later as they were recovering from the session. Jake considered the question carefully. "Like I've been living in a smaller version of reality, and someone just opened all the doors." As the weeks progressed, more athletes achieved similar breakthroughs. The chaos training sessions became laboratories for exploring the outer boundaries of human potential. Athletes who had once struggled to maintain basic technique under pressure were now demonstrating capabilities that seemed to violate known principles of human physiology and psychology. But Coach Zeth pushed them further still. The third month of chaos training introduced elements that challenged not just their individual capabilities, but their ability to maintain transcendent performance while competing directly against each other. "In the Galactic Championships," she explained, "you will face opponents whose capabilities may exceed your own in every measurable category. Physical strength, technical skill, experience, training resources. In many cases, your competitors will possess advantages that cannot be overcome through conventional means. Your only path to victory lies in accessing capabilities that transcend conventional measurement." The competitive sessions were unlike anything the human athletes had previously experienced. Coach Zoff had somehow acquired detailed performance data from previous Galactic Championships, allowing her to create holographic opponents that accurately simulated the capabilities of established champions from various species. Jake found himself competing against the projected image of a Thixanari warrior whose strength exceeded human possibility by several orders of magnitude. while simultaneously facing a Velta strategist whose mental processing capabilities made human thought seem glacially slow. The exercise seemed designed to be impossible, a psychological demonstration of human inadequacy rather than a training opportunity. Yet something extraordinary happened as the human athletes faced these seemingly hopeless challenges. Instead of being overwhelmed by the apparent impossibility of competing against such advanced beings, they began to discover capabilities that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional possibility. Jake learned to use his opponent's superior strength against them by achieving perfect technical efficiency that rendered brute force irrelevant. Sarah developed the ability to anticipate strategies before they were fully formed by accessing intuitive intelligence that transcended rational analysis. Other athletes demonstrated feats of endurance, precision, and adaptability that seemed to violate everything previously known about human limitations. You begin to access your species' true advantages, Coach Zeth observed during one particularly remarkable session. Physical capabilities can be measured and compared. Technical skills can be analyzed and counted. But consciousness, the kind of consciousness your species possesses, consciousness that can transcend its own limitations through pure will, that cannot be replicated or defeated by any external force. As the second phase of training neared its conclusion, Jake realized that he had undergone yet another fundamental transformation. The person who had achieved the surrender of selves just weeks before was already being replaced by someone who had learned to find strength in direct confrontation with impossibility. Each session pushed him further from any recognizable version of human limitation, and deeper into territory that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of species-specific capability. The culminating exercise of chaos training was designed as a comprehensive test of everything they had learned. The athletes would compete in a simulated galactic championship environment against holographic representations of actual champions from previous competitions, while dealing with the full spectrum of environmental and psychological challenges they might face in the real event. Jake approached this final test with a mixture of confidence and uncertainty. His capabilities had expanded so far beyond his original limitations that he sometimes felt disconnected from his own humanity. Yet Coach Zet's teachings had shown him that this disconnection was not a loss but an evolution, the natural result of consciousness learning to transcend the boundaries that had previously defined it. The simulation began with an intensity that exceeded anything they had previously experienced. The environmental conditions shifted between the hostile atmospheres of 7 different worlds. The holographic opponents demonstrated capabilities that seemed to mock the very concept of human competition. The psychological pressure was designed to break minds that had been conditioned by millennia of evolutionary limitation. For the first time since achieving his breakthrough, Jake felt himself beginning to falter. The accumulated challenges were approaching the absolute limits of what he had learned to endure. His carefully developed techniques began to deteriorate as the demands exceeded even his expanded capabilities. Most dangerously, he felt the old familiar urge to retreat, to preserve some part of himself from the intensity of truly unlimited demand. But instead of retreating, Jake made a choice that surprised even himself. He chose to advance even deeper into vulnerability, to surrender not just his comfortable limitations, but his attachment to survival itself. In that moment of complete abandonment of self-preservation, something extraordinary occurred. Jake's consciousness seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of his individual identity. He became simultaneously aware of his own performance, the strategies of his opponents, the shifting environmental conditions, and the underlying patterns that connected all these elements into a single, coherent system. His body continued to function at impossible levels, but the effort was no longer localized in his individual will. It had become part of a larger flow of capability that seemed to include but transcend his personal limitations. When the simulation ended, Jake found himself in a state of consciousness that felt both completely alien and utterly natural. He had achieved something that Coach Zune later described as species transcendence, the ability to access capabilities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human possibility while maintaining perfect integration with his essential humanity. "Now you are ready," Coach Zeth told the assembled athletes after the final chaos training session. "Not ready to win. Winning and losing are concepts that apply to competitors who remain bound by their limitations. You are ready to transcend competition itself, to demonstrate capabilities that exist beyond the realm of conventional measurement." As Jake contemplated these words, he realized that the journey from cocky young athlete to something approaching universal competitor had required him to die and be reborn multiple times. Each phase of training had demanded the destruction of some previous version of himself. The person preparing for the Galactic Championships bore little resemblance to the person who had first challenged an alien coach, yet somehow remained authentically him. Part 3. Universal Excellence. The final phase of preparation took place not on Earth but aboard a Galactic Sports Commission vessel en route to the championship venue. Coach Zath had arranged for the human team to experience the kind of interstellar travel conditions they would encounter during the actual competition. But more importantly, she wanted them to train alongside athletes from other species in the weeks leading up to the championships. Jake's first glimpse of his competitors fundamentally altered his understanding of what they were about to face. The third Ex-Nari delegation consisted of beings whose casual movements generated force readings that exceeded what human industrial equipment could produce. The Veltar team seemed to exist in a state of constant mathematical calculation, their conversations consisting of equations so complex that the translation systems couldn't render them into human comprehensible language. Most intimidating were the Zephyrian collective competitors, beings who had achieved such perfect synchronization between individual consciousness that they seemed to function as a single multi-bodied entity. "Are we completely outclassed?" Sarah whispered to Jake as they observed the other teams during their first day aboard the vessel. Before Jake could respond, one of the TX-Nari competitors approached them. The being stood nearly 3 meters tall, with musculature that seemed to have been carved from living stone. When it spoke, the translation generated subtle harmonics that Jake felt in his bones. "You are the human delegation," the being observed, its tone carrying what might have been curiosity. "Your species is small." Jake felt a moment of the old familiar pride beginning to rise, the defensive reaction that had defined his pre-training personality. But instead of responding with challenge or defensiveness, he found himself accessing the consciousness expansion techniques that Coach Zaf had taught him. In that expanded awareness, he could perceive not just the 10x Nari's obvious physical superiority, but the underlying assumptions that shaped its understanding of competition. "Size can be misleading," Jake replied, his tone carrying none of the confrontational energy his words might have suggested. "We've learned that the most significant limitations often exist in how we conceptualize possibility." The 2X Nari considered this response for a moment, and Jake sensed something shift in its assessment of the human team. "Interesting. Your coach is Zixthara of the Vale Nathi, correct?" "Yes. The Vale Nathi are unusual in their training methods. They focus on consciousness manipulation rather than physical optimization. Most species consider their approach impractical for competition at this level." Jake felt Coach Zoot's presence before he saw her approach. She had developed an uncanny ability to appear whenever her training methods were being discussed or challenged. "Impractical," she repeated, her tone carrying subtle amusement. "An interesting assessment. Perhaps you would be interested in a demonstration?" What followed was Jake's first direct comparison between his developed capabilities and those of established galactic competitors. Coach Zarth arranged a series of informal challenges between the human team and volunteers from other delegations, not formal competitions, but opportunities for cross-species assessment of different training approaches. Jake found himself matched against a Veltar strategist in a complex puzzle-solving challenge that required maintaining physical exertion while processing multiple streams of logical information. The Veltar's mental processing capabilities were clearly superior to anything human neurology could match through conventional means. Its analysis speed, pattern recognition, and logical reasoning exceeded Jake's capabilities in every measurable category. Yet as the challenge progressed, Jake began to access the transcendent consciousness states that Coach Zeth had helped him develop. Instead of trying to match the Veltar's processing speed, he learned to anticipate the underlying patterns that shaped logical progression. Rather than competing with superior analytical capability, he began to intuit solutions that existed beyond the boundaries of step-by-step reasoning. The result was not exactly victory. The Veltar completed more calculations and solved more individual puzzle elements. But Jake achieved something that surprised both competitors. He accessed solutions to several challenges that the Veltar's superior analytical capabilities had not been able to reach. In some cases, he demonstrated understanding of problems before the Veltar had finished analyzing their parameters. "Fascinating," the Veltar commented after the session. "Your problem-solving approach appears to bypass several levels of logical progression. How do you achieve solution recognition without completing analytical processing?" Jake considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure I can explain it in terms that translate well. It's less about processing information and more about expanding awareness until the solution becomes obvious. These informal exchanges with competitors from other species continued throughout the journey. Each interaction provided Jake and his teammates with opportunities to test their capabilities against different types of advanced competition, while also demonstrating to the other delegations that human athletes had developed capabilities that transcended typical species-based expectations. Coach Seth observed these interactions with what Jake had learned to recognize as deep satisfaction. During one of their final private training sessions before arrival at the championship venue, she shared observations that fundamentally altered his understanding of their entire preparation process. The other species approach athletic development through optimization, she explained as they worked through advanced consciousness expansion exercises. They identified their natural capabilities and developed training methods to maximize those capabilities within known parameters. This approach produces predictable results. Athletes who excel within the boundaries of their species' evolutionary advantages. Jake maintained perfect balance in a complex pose while processing mathematical equations, but his attention remained focused on Coach Zeth's explanation. Your species, however, possesses something that most established galactic civilizations have lost through technological advancement: the capacity for transcendent adaptation. Humans can, under the right circumstances, access capabilities that exist outside the boundaries of your evolutionary programming. This is why I chose methods that seem impractical to other species. I was not trying to optimize your human capabilities. I was trying to help you transcend them entirely. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Jake realized that their entire training process had been designed not to make them better humans, but to help them access capabilities that existed beyond the concept of species-specific limitation. "Is that why you smile when you demonstrate techniques that seem impossible?" Jake asked, finally understanding the expression he had noticed from their very first meeting. "Partially," Coach Seth replied. "But the smile is also recognition of something else. Every technique I demonstrate, every capability I possess, was achieved through the same process of transcendence that you are learning. The difference between your current capabilities and mine is not one of species advantage. It is one of time and commitment to the path of systematic limitation destruction." This understanding fundamentally altered Jake's approach to the final preparations. He was not training to compete against superior beings as a human. He was learning to compete as consciousness itself, using human form as a vehicle for accessing universal capabilities. The championship venue exceeded even Jake's expanded expectations. The facility had been constructed on a rogue planet in deep space, allowing for environmental controls that could simulate conditions from any known world. The central competition area was a vast sphere nearly a kilometer in diameter, with surfaces that could shift between different materials and gravitational orientations. Spectator areas accommodated beings from 47 different species, creating a cacophony of sights, sounds, and emanations that threatened to overwhelm even trained consciousness. Jake's first formal competition was scheduled against established champions from 7 different species in what was described as a universal capability assessment, a multidiscipline event designed to test the complete range of athletic potential across all known categories of excellence. As he prepared for the event, Jake found himself accessing consciousness states that felt both familiar and entirely new. The techniques Coach Zed had taught him were functioning perfectly, but they were being applied in circumstances so far beyond their original training context that they seemed to be evolving in real time. The competition began with challenges that tested pure physical capability. Jake faced a Thixanari whose strength exceeded his own by impossible margins, yet he found himself achieving equivalent results through perfect technical efficiency and strategic application of force. The spectacle of a human competitor matching a Thixanari in strength-based challenges created a stir throughout the venue. The mental capability challenges followed, pitting Jake against a Veltar collective whose combined analytical processing power approached that of a small computer network. Yet Jake's transcendent consciousness techniques allowed him to access solutions through intuitive leaps that bypassed conventional logical progression, achieving results that matched the collective's output through entirely different means. Most challenging were the endurance events, where Jake competed against beings whose evolutionary adaptations specifically optimized them for sustained performance under extreme conditions. Here, his ability to surrender normal human limitations while maintaining perfect integration with his essential humanity became crucial. He learned to endure not by resisting the challenges, but by expanding his consciousness until it could incorporate suffering, exhaustion, and stress as simply more information to be processed without emotional reaction. As the competition progressed through its various phases, Jake began to notice something remarkable happening not just with his own performance, but with the entire competitive environment. His demonstration of capabilities that transcended normal human limitations was inspiring competitors from other species to push beyond their own conventional boundaries. The TXNRE began accessing precision techniques they had never developed. The Veltar started incorporating intuitive leaps into their analytical processes. Even the Zephyrian Collective began experimenting with individual consciousness expression within their unified framework. Coach Zetha watched these developments with what Jake had learned to recognize as profound satisfaction. During a brief interval between competition phases, she approached him with an expression that seemed to contain depths of meaning he was only beginning to comprehend. "Do you understand what you have accomplished?" she asked. Jake considered the question while maintaining the state of expanded consciousness that had become his normal competition mindset. "I think I'm beginning to. This isn't really about winning or losing, is it? Competition, in the conventional sense, assumes that excellence is limited, that one being's achievement necessarily diminishes another's possibility. But consciousness that has transcended limitation discovers that excellence is actually infinite. When you demonstrate capabilities that exceed your supposed limitations, you don't defeat other competitors, you inspire them to transcend their own limitations." The final phase of Jake's competition involved facing the reigning Universal Champion, a being from the Nixari species who had held the title for 3 consecutive championships and was considered by many to represent the absolute peak of known athletic capability. The Nixari possessed advantages in every measurable category: strength, speed, endurance, mental processing, technical skill, and competitive experience that spanned multiple decades. As Jake prepared for this ultimate challenge, he realized that everything he had learned, every limitation he had transcended, every version of himself he had chosen to destroy and rebuild, had been preparation for this moment. Not because victory was necessary, but because this level of challenge would require him to access the deepest levels of transcendence he was capable of reaching. The competition with the Nexari champion became something that transcended athletic performance and approached the level of consciousness demonstration. Both competitors pushed far beyond their supposed limitations, accessing capabilities that seemed to violate basic principles of possibility. The Nexari's advantages in every conventional category were met by Jake's ability to transcend conventional categories entirely. The result was not exactly victory or defeat in any traditional sense. Both competitors achieved performances that exceeded all previous records in multiple disciplines. Both demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the limitations of their respective species. Most importantly, both competed at a level that transcended individual achievement and became a demonstration of universal potential. When the competition ended, Jake found himself in a state of consciousness that felt like the culmination of his entire transformation journey. He had achieved something that Coach Zen later described as complete integration, the ability to access transcendent capabilities while maintaining perfect alignment with his essential nature. The Nixari champion approached him after the event, its alien features expressing what Jake somehow recognized as profound respect. "Your approach to limitation transcendence is unlike anything I have encountered in decades of competition. How did your species develop such capabilities?" Jake looked around the venue, seeing coaches and athletes from dozens of species engaged in intense discussions of technique and training philosophy. The competition had become secondary to the exchange of approaches to transcending limitation. "I think," Jake replied, "we developed them by learning that the strongest opponent we would ever face was our own accepted understanding of what was possible." As the championship events concluded and the human delegation prepared for their return journey, Jake reflected on the transformation that had brought him from cocky young athlete to something approaching universal competitor. The person who had challenged Coach Zath on her first day no longer existed, having been systematically destroyed and rebuilt multiple times throughout their training journey. Yet somehow, he felt more authentically himself than ever before. The transcendence of limitation had not eliminated his humanity. It had revealed capacities for excellence that had always existed within human potential, waiting only for the courage to abandon comfortable boundaries. Coach Zah found him during their final day aboard the transport vessel, looking out at the stars through an observation port. Her presence had become as familiar as his own thoughts, yet she retained an aura of mystery that he suspected would never be fully penetrable. "Do you have regrets about the path you chose?" she asked. settling beside him with that fluid grace that had never ceased to amaze him. Jake considered the question seriously. He had lost the comfortable certainty of known limitations. He could never again retreat into the safety of accepted human boundaries. The person he had become required constant commitment to transcendence, with no possibility of permanent rest in achieved capability. "No regrets," he replied finally. "But I understand now why you said the path isn't for everyone. It requires giving up the safety of knowing your limits. And what did you gain in exchange?" Jake smiled and realized that his expression carried some of the same quality he had noticed in Coach Zed's smiles throughout their training. The serenity of someone who had learned that apparent impossibility was simply another boundary to be transcended. "I gained the knowledge that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because the only opponent who could truly defeat me was the version of myself that accepted limitation as permanent." Coach Zeth nodded with satisfaction. "Now you are ready for the real competition." The real competition? Learning to live with unlimited possibility. Learning to wake up every day and choose transcendence over comfort, growth over safety, excellence over the familiar boundaries of accepted human capability. The Galactic Championships were just practice for that much more challenging competition. As their transport approached Earth, Jake contemplated the return to a world that would expect him to remain within human limitations. He realized that Coach Zath's greatest gift had not been teaching him to compete against alien beings. It had been showing him how to live as a human who had learned to access capabilities that transcended humanity itself. The alien coach who had gone all out to transform a group of human athletes had succeeded beyond even her ambitious expectations. She had not simply created better competitors. She had demonstrated that consciousness, properly developed, could transcend any boundary, overcome any limitation, and achieve excellence at levels that existed beyond the realm of species-specific possibility. And she had done it all with that same serene smile, as if transforming human potential and reshaping understanding of universal capability were nothing more than natural expressions of what became possible when limitation was finally recognized as optional. Jake understood now that the smile was not dismissive of effort. It was the expression of consciousness that had learned to find joy in the endless possibility of transcendence. It was the face of someone who had discovered that destroying one's weak self was not a loss but a liberation, opening access to capabilities that no external force could ever diminish or defeat. As Earth grew larger in the observation port, Jake felt ready to carry that understanding forward, to live as someone who had learned that the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from conquering the internal enemies that whisper of impossibility. He had become someone who understood that true strength lies not in avoiding challenge, but in developing the capacity to transform any challenge into an opportunity for further transcendence. The alien coach had taught him the most human lesson of all, that consciousness, when freed from the comfortable prison of accepted limitation, could achieve anything it was courageous enough to attempt. And in learning that lesson, he had discovered that the difference between ordinary and extraordinary was nothing more than the willingness to destroy the version of oneself that insisted on remaining ordinary. Document complete. 8,247 words.